is the front line in the fight against the so-called Islamic State in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Islamist militia Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, killed more than 40 people in an attack on a Catholic church in the DRC. Several houses and shops were also burned in a town in Ituri province. The ADF rebel group, which is backed by the so-called Islamic State, has its roots in neighboring Uganda.
Murdered with machetes, gunned down, or found dead in their burned homes. ADF fighters burst into the Catholic Church, picked out worshippers who were taking part in a night vigil, tied them up and killed them. Children, women, and men. Dozens of the victims were buried in this mass grave.
We are truly shocked. Children and women have been killed. We wonder what the security forces deployed in Komanda are doing. They are not doing their job. They are doing nothing at all. The Congolese army is there. MONUSCO, the UN organization mission in the DRC, is there. But they are doing absolutely nothing.
The attack in Komanda is just one in a spate of recent deadly assaults led by the ADF in eastern DRC. The armed group, linked to the Islamic State, operates alongside many other militias in the region. This just days after the Congolese government signed a roadmap to end the fighting with Rwanda and the M23 rebel group, mediated by Qatar and the U.S. Despite the complex security situation, President Donald Trump seemed confident that he can bring peace.
They liked Trump. They wanted to make a trade deal with Trump. They wanted us to take their rare earth. They want to give us their rare earth. And I got to know the leader of the Congo. I got to know both of them indirectly. And I called him. I said, let's end the war. I don't want anything until you end the war. And we ended the war. As you know, the foreign ministers came up 2 weeks ago, and the leaders are going to be coming very shortly to Washington, Rwanda and Congo.
But in Komanda, where survivors are left to bury their loved ones, any prospect of peace remains distant, hidden behind the haunting memories of the night of terror.
For more on this, let's bring in Raymond Mujuni, a seasoned governance and international relations expert from Uganda. Hello, Raymond. Welcome to the program. Now, this latest attack is just one of several deadly ADF assaults in the DRC's east in recent months. Who exactly are the ADF and what is their connection to Uganda and ISIS?
Thank you so much for having me. Of course, ADF is a rebel group operating out of the eastern DRC. They're an Islamist rebel group which started their rebellion in Uganda, got pushed out of Uganda and moved into the eastern DRC. 4 years ago, the DRC government asked the government of Uganda to go into the DRC and help them deal with the ADF. And for the last 4 years, the Ugandan army has had a presence in the eastern DRC, more specifically to deal with this rebel group called the ADF. They're a very Islamist group linked to ISIS, with links to Al-Qaeda too, and they've been operating out of the eastern DRC and have been cited by the UN to be responsible for gross violations in that part of the country.
Right, right. You know, some figures suggest that the start of the year was the bloodiest since 2002 when DRC was in civil war. Why are the ADF stepping up attacks now?
It's because of this, the fact that you have changing nature of geography within the eastern DRC. The eastern DRC previously was under the control of the Kinshasa government. Since then, we've had the M23 AFC take over most parts of the eastern DRC. They occupy Goma now, they occupy Beni, and they've become the political and military occupants of the eastern DRC. That's forced the ADF, which has been traditionally operating in the eastern DRC, to deal with the AFC and M23, but also the fact that they've got the UPDF on their heels, and the UPDF has been expanding its scope inside the eastern DRC and launching attacks against them. So one of the reasons why you see a lot of attacks is because, one, they're desperate. They've been moved out of their traditional triangle of death deeper into the eastern DRC, and they're operating out of areas where they have less food supply, less money supply, and they've got to act very fast to be able to survive.
Right. That's pretty interesting. Some experts are also warning that the ADF fighters could be increasing attacks to remain relevant to counter, regional peace efforts. What do you make of that?
I mean, that could be one of the things to look at. But the ADF have traditionally been relevant as a rebel group fighting in the Eastern DRC to attack Uganda. They've controlled some parts of the Eastern DRC using taxes, using fighting groups, but they've not traditionally been the strongest rebel group inside the Eastern DRC because they don't occupy territory, they don't have political aims in that territory, and therefore, because they have no political aims in territory, their work has been really cut out, which is to stage attacks for the purpose of getting into Uganda.
I see. Well, you mentioned the M23 rebel group. They at least were able to come to the negotiating table and, make some clear demands. Is that even possible with the ADF who keep committing such massacres?
Well, at the moment, it's impossible because the ADF's fight and war is against the Ugandan government, and the Ugandan government has not indicated any willingness to have any talks with them. The AFC M23 control territory. They have political motivation, and because they control territory, they end up in conversations that are politically motivated around the future of the Eastern DRC. Today, for example, you couldn't govern the Eastern DRC without AFC and M23 because they command the two biggest capitals of the Eastern DRC, and they have political control over them. And they are also borderline with Rwanda. They are at the border with Uganda in Bunagana. So they're a very political outfit. The ADF is not that. The ADF is a terrorist rebel group. They use terror, they use incidents of terror to further their political aims. They're not into political governance. They don't have territory that they command and control.
Right. I mean, what's still interesting, and maybe you can hammer a bit more on that, is that you say the ADF basically they want to do anything to hurt the Ugandan government, but what did they gain from killing innocent people inside the DRC to get the attention of the Ugandan government? Something doesn't add up there.
So traditionally, the ADF, when they were founded, their first massacre was on Ugandan soil, and their cause is really to use terror as the furtherance of their political motivation. So what you're seeing are attacks that are designed specifically to spark terror within communities and force those communities to work with them. It's been their modus operandi for a long time. Even in the Eastern DRC, in the Triangle of Death where they were operating, they traditionally targeted civilians and carried out mass massacres just for the purpose of furthering their political motivations. They're not a traditional rebel group that takes over territory and looks to govern and administer that territory. They use the use of terror. They're linked to ISIS, they're linked to Al-Qaeda, and every time they commit these mass acts of terror, they're very quick to claim them so that they can use them for their financing through the ISIS route and through the Al-Qaeda routes. Right.
I mean, look, we're talking about the ADF now. It is just one of about 100 or more armed groups operating in Eastern DRC. Why are there so many militias fighting inside one country?
That's a very long history lesson if we had to get into it, but it's an effect of colonialism because the colonial government parceled out the Eastern DRC in such a difficult way that it had multiple ethnic groups existing on different sides of different borders. Now, some rebel groups in the Eastern DRC are typically defensive rebel groups. They exist to defend communities, their communities, against other communities. Some rebel groups inside the Eastern DRC are rebel groups that committed genocide in Rwanda and fled to the DRC, and therefore they're being hunted by the Rwandan government. Some rebel groups like the ADF committed atrocities in Uganda and fled into the Eastern DRC. Traditionally, the Eastern DRC has not been administered by the government in Kinshasa. So it's been a very active hub. It's mountainous, it's hilly, it's very hard in terms of terrain to get along. So it allows for rebel groups to operate there. But something has changed in the nature and texture. I don't think there are still hundreds of rebel groups. Multiple rebel groups have formed coalitions, particularly with the AFC and M23. And now Codeco, for example, there are few rebel groups which are still fighting for the purpose of taking over territory.
Right. Well, at the end of the day, many from the international community are trying to broker some sort of peace inside the DRC because for decades there's not been peace. Donald Trump just brokered a peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda. Meanwhile, Qatar is leading separate talks with the DRC and M23 rebels. But can such international efforts produce, sustainable peace? Or are they out of touch with the complex realities on the ground? Because it is indeed complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, peace in the DRC is a very complex matter. I think the one peace process that's closer to getting a sustainable and durable peace deal would be the East African community and the South African development community. Those two communities have been together working in what they call the Nairobi process, which is getting closer to a resolution of a peaceful settlement inside the DRC. What we've seen with Washington has been the capacity of Washington to use the US's massive global appeal at a large scale to stop further hostilities, to stop the M23 in their advance, and also get the DRC government to listen to the concerns of the M23. What we saw with the Doha peace process was also a cessation of hostilities between M23 and the government of Kinshasa. That's what those two have achieved, but they're nowhere near a durable peace deal. Please remember that there's been more than 6 different peace deals. In fact, the M23, the name M23 itself comes from a peace deal that was signed in March 23rd and was violated by the Congolese government. So we're still a long mile away from peace.
Still, I like the sound of making progress. Let's look at it as a glass half full, although I understand the complexities you're trying to make here. This upcoming trip to the US that is slated for the leaders of DRC and Rwanda, what's in it for all sides, you think?
I think what the US has been able to achieve is to get the DRC to accept that Rwanda has some valid contestations around the way the DRC and the M23 behave inside the Eastern DRC, and that has an effect on the sovereignty of Rwanda. But it's also been able to slow the advance of the M23 and get them to cease hostilities with the government in Kinshasa. I think that what they will achieve most importantly is to stop hostilities. And because there's been a stop in hostilities, then you can have a path towards peace talks, a path towards integration, a path towards a government, perhaps of national unity inside the DRC. But the closer that the DRC gets to an election, remember, there are many actors inside the DRC who are not represented in Washington. For example, the former president, Joseph Kabila, is inside the Eastern DRC currently. He's not represented in Washington and could be a very big actor in terms of getting peace inside the Eastern DRC. So yes, Washington is a good process, but the key process that will bring peace inside the Eastern DRC remains a Nairobi peace process because that's more representative of all the groups inside the Eastern DRC.
Right. Only time will tell how things pan out. Raymond Mujuni, governance and international relations expert from Uganda. Thank you very much for your insights.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.